They say Willow Lane is where the perfect people go to sleep, but some of us are just better at dreaming with our eyes open. The shadows on Willow Lane do not fall so much as they rise, seeping up from the cracked pavement and the overgrown roots of the ancient oaks, like a dark tide that arrives with the punctuality of a stopped clock. And in the breathless silence of the late afternoon, Evelyn Reed sat in her high-backed wing chair behind the heavy velvet curtains of house number 12, waiting for the light to die completely so that her real work could begin.
She did not move, for movement was a luxury she could rarely afford when the stakes were this high, and the arthritis in her knees was merely a secondary reason for her stillness, serving as a convenient excuse for the outside world, while the true reason was the predator's patience she had cultivated over 40 years of cataloging human error. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper and dried lavender, a cloying perfume that masked the underlying smell of damp foundation and decaying wood. And to anyone else, this room would have felt like a museum or a mausoleum, a place where time had calcified into dust. But to Evelyn, it was a command center, a bunker lined with books that were not merely stories, but records, references, and hiding places.
Her eyes, clouded by the milky film of age, but sharpened by a paranoia that had kept her alive when others had faded away, were fixed on the sliver of glass exposed by a deliberate gap in the drapes, a gap no wider than a knife blade, through which she commanded a direct line of sight to the imposing Georgian facade of house number 1. That was the fortress of Judge Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for moral absolutism was as carefully constructed as the brickwork of his home. And as Evelyn watched the last bruised purple of the sunset reflect off his pristine windows, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that was not fear, but the vibration of a secret trying to claw its way out of her throat.
She knew things about the judge that would turn the neighborhood's polite nods into gasps of horror, things that lay dormant in the basement beneath her feet, wrapped in plastic and silence, waiting for the moment when the balance of power on Willow Lane would shift enough to make the truth a weapon rather than a liability. The street outside was deceptively quiet, a stillness that a casual observer might mistake for peace, but Evelyn knew better, for she understood that Willow Lane was an ecosystem of surveillance, where every drawn blind concealed a watcher, and every manicured lawn hid the scars of excavation.
To her left, 2 houses down, the residence of Leo and Maya Chen hummed with the invisible electricity of servers and digital eyes, their smart home a fortress of glass and algorithm that felt alien against the traditional architecture of the street. And further down, the overgrown yard of Silas Blackwood at number 13 seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a black hole of taxidermy and chemical smells that kept even the stray cats at bay. But it was house number 1 that held the gravity, the center of the web, where Judge Thorne sat like a bloated spider, convinced that his retirement was a sanctuary rather than a waiting room for consequences. Evelyn shifted her weight, the leather of her chair groaning softly in the gloom, and she reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the brass telescope that sat on the tripod beside her, a relic from the First War that she had purchased at an estate sale 3 decades ago, its lenses scratched but powerful, capable of stripping away the distance between her sanctuary and the judge's sins. She pressed her eye to the cold metal rim, her breath fogging the eyepiece for a brief second before she controlled her respiration, slowing her heart rate with the discipline of a sniper, and brought the front door of house number 1 into sharp, terrifying focus. The brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, gleamed with an arrogant polish, and the porch light had just flickered on, a yellow beacon that signaled the judge was awake, alert, and perhaps expecting someone, or perhaps simply afraid of what the darkness might bring to his doorstep. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were usually quiet, a day when the rhythm of the street was dictated by the distant hum of traffic from the main road
and the occasional rattle of Martha Higgins's patrol cart as she completed her early rounds. But tonight felt different, heavy, with a barometric pressure that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the alignment of history.
Evelyn had felt it in her bones since morning, a deep ache that signaled a storm of human-making. And now, as she watched a black sedan turn slowly onto Willow Lane, its headlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights, she knew that the timeline she had been monitoring for 20 years was about to rupture. The car moved with a predatory slowness, crawling past the dark windows of Julian Vane's crypto-funded fortress at number 15, past the silent, lightless bulk of Silas Blackwood's home, and past her own hidden vantage point, the tires crunching softly on the asphalt, as if trying to sneak up on the pavement itself.
She held her breath, her fingers tightening on the focus wheel of the telescope as the vehicle drifted toward the end of the cul-de-sac, toward the one house that had reason to fear the arrival of strangers in the night. And when the brake lights flared red, painting the judge's driveway in the color of fresh blood, Evelyn knew that the overdue account had finally come for collection.
The car engine died, but the lights remained off, plunging the vehicle into a silhouette against the manicured hedges. And for a long minute, nothing happened. A pause that stretched the tension in Evelyn's chest until it felt like a piano wire pulled to the breaking point. She imagined the driver sitting there, checking a piece of paper, or perhaps loading a gun, or maybe just gathering the courage to confront the man who had sold his soul for a gavel and a robe. And then, with a sound that carried clearly through the cold night air, the driver's door opened.
A young man stepped out, his movements stiff and jerky, and even from this distance, through the distortion of the antique glass, Evelyn felt a shock of recognition that made her gasp, a sound that was swallowed instantly by the heavy velvet of the room.
He was tall, thin to the point of gauntness, wearing a jacket that was too large for his frame. But it was not his clothes that stopped Evelyn's heart. It was the way he held his head, a defiant tilt that she had seen before in a courtroom 20 years ago, on a man who had been dragged away screaming that he was innocent, that the fire was an accident, that the judge had promised him protection. This boy, for he was barely more than a boy, was the ghost of that man, the echo of a life destroyed by Marcus Thorne's ambition. And as he walked up the driveway toward the lion-headed knocker, Evelyn realized that he was the son, the legacy of the arsonist, returned to the scene of the judicial crime to demand answers that could not be given without destroying the fragile peace of Willow Lane. Evelyn pulled back from the telescope, her mind racing through the catalog of her archives, visualizing the specific box, the specific folder, the specific red tape that bound the transcript she had stolen from the clerk's office in 1998, a theft that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of the appeal, but which now constituted the only leverage she had against the darkness that was gathering across the street. She needed to be sure. She needed to verify that the face she had seen matched the photograph she had clipped from the obituary column 5 years ago when the father had died in prison. And so she leaned back in, pressing her eye so hard against the metal that it hurt, watching as the young man raised his hand to the door. He did not knock. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the wood, and then, as if summoned by a silent command, the door opened inward, revealing the silhouette of Judge Thorne, not in his robe, but in a dressing gown that looked like a shroud, his posture stooped, his head bowed, as if he had been expecting this executioner for a lifetime. There were no shouts, no violent gestures, just a quiet exchange of words that Evelyn could not hear but could feel in the vibration of the air, a transaction of guilt and accusation. And then the judge stepped aside, a gesture of surrender that allowed the young man to cross the threshold and enter the house, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in Evelyn's mind. She sat back, her hands trembling in her lap, the silence of her own house suddenly oppressive,
filled with the accusing stares of the books that lined the walls, thousands of stories that had endings, unlike the story unfolding across the street, which was spiraling into a chaos she had long predicted but never truly prepared for.
She knew what was in the red file. She knew the specific lines of testimony that Thorne had stricken from the record, the evidence of the accelerant that had been planted, the payoff that had been routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, details that she had memorized and hoarded like a dragon guarding gold that was actually radioactive waste.
She could not stay in the chair. The passive observation was over, and the time for active verification had begun. So she forced her stiff limbs to move, pushing herself up with a groan that was lost in the vastness of the room, and she reached for her cane, the smooth hickory handle cool and reassuring against her palm.
She needed to go down, down into the belly of the house, down to the basement, where the air was stable and the humidity was controlled, where the red file lived in its fireproof box, waiting for the day it would be needed to burn a reputation to the ground. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the transom window above the front door, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the floral wallpaper like specters of the librarians who had lived here before her, women who had also known the value of silence and the power of written words. Her footsteps on the runner carpet were soft, a rhythmic shuffling that she had perfected over years of insomnia, and as she passed the kitchen, she resisted the urge to turn on the light, for light was a signal, a betrayal of presence, and tonight she needed to be a ghost in her own home, invisible to the watchers who might be looking back at her from the Chin House or from the darkness of the Blackwood estate. The door to the basement was located under the main staircase, a narrow panel of oak that looked like a closet but opened into a descent into history, and Evelyn unlocked it with a key she kept on a chain around her neck, the metal warm from her body heat, the lock tumbling with a heavy oiled click that felt satisfyingly secure. She opened the door, and a smell hit her instantly. The scent of old paper intensified 1,000 times, mixed with the sharpness of vinegar and the dry, dusty odor of a tomb that had been sealed for centuries, a smell that to her was the perfume of truth. She flipped the switch at the top of the stairs, and a single bare bulb buzzed to life below, casting a harsh interrogation room light over the wooden steps that descended steeply into the concrete foundation of the house, and Evelyn began her descent, one hand gripping the rail, the other clutching her cane, counting the steps as she went, 1, 2, 3, reciting the numbers like a mantra to ward off the fear that she might slip and break a hip, leaving her to die alone in the dark, with only her secrets for company. The basement was a labyrinth of metal shelving units, floor-to-ceiling stacks that created narrow aisles of claustrophobic height, filled with boxes, binders, and loose papers, a physical manifestation of her obsessive need to document the world around her, to prove that chaos could be ordered if one simply had enough filing cabinets. She moved to the section marked 1990-1999, her shadow stretching long and thin against the concrete floor, a distorted giant that mimicked her movements with a lag that felt supernatural, though she knew it was merely physics. The box she sought was on the third shelf, a red banker's box that was distinct from the gray and white ones surrounding it, a color choice that was both a warning and a categorization. And as she reached for it, her shoulder screaming in protest, she felt a sudden, irrational conviction that the box would be empty, that someone had come in while she slept and stolen the proof, leaving her with nothing but her paranoia. But the box was heavy, dense with the weight of condensed suffering, and she pulled it down, setting it on the small reading table she kept in the center of the room, a table illuminated by a green shaded banker's lamp that she switched on with a trembling click. She sat on the wooden stool, her breath coming in short, shallow rasps, and lifted the lid of the box, the cardboard friction creating a sound like a gasp. revealing the contents that had not seen the light of day since the turn of the millennium. There it was, the transcript, bound in a blue legal cover that had faded to gray at the edges, the paper yellowing and brittle, but the typed words still stark and black, accusing and undeniable.
She opened it to page 42, the page where the court stenographer had recorded a disruption, a moment where the defendant had shouted about a man in a black car, a man who had given him the lighter fluid, a man who looked exactly like the young version of Marcus Thorne.
The judge had stricken it from the record, declared it inadmissible hearsay, silenced the court with the bang of his gavel. But Evelyn had the original raw notes, the ones the stenographer had thrown in the trash and which Evelyn, then a junior archivist at the courthouse, had retrieved with shaking hands, knowing that she was holding a grenade.
She ran her finger over the text, the texture of the typewriter ribbon ink still palpable under her skin, and as she read the words, the memory of that day came flooding back, the smell of floor wax and fear in the courtroom, the look in Thorne's eyes, cold and dead as a shark's, as he sentenced an innocent man to a cage, where he would eventually rot.
But now the sun was here, inside the house, and the equation had changed. The debt was no longer abstract. It was physical, present, and potentially violent. Evelyn closed the file, the dust motes dancing in the cone of green light, and she wondered what was happening across the street at this very second, whether the judge was confessing or begging, or perhaps reaching for the gun he kept in the drawer of his mahogany desk, the pearl-handled revolver that he claimed was a gift from a grateful mayor, but which Evelyn knew was an insurance policy against exactly this kind of night.
She needed to know, she needed to see, and the basement, for all its safety, was blind. It offered history but not current intelligence, and so she knew she had to ascend, to go back to the window, to the telescope, to the vigil. She stood up, her knees popping, and left the file on the table, open, a silent accusation waiting for a jury that would never come. And she climbed the stairs, the ascent harder than the descent, her breath laboring as she pulled herself up to the ground floor, emerging back into the hallway where the shadows had lengthened and deepened, transforming the familiar contours of her home into a landscape of threats. She moved back to the living room, to the wing chair, but she did not sit. Instead, she stood by the curtain, pressing her face to the gap, ignoring the cold radiation of the glass against her cheek. The car was still there, a dark stain on the driveway, but the porch light had been extinguished, plunging the front of house number 1 into darkness, a darkness that felt deliberate, tactical, a veil drawn over a crime in progress.
Evelyn adjusted the telescope, panning across the facade of the house, looking for a sliver of light, a movement, anything that would tell her who was winning the confrontation inside. And then she saw it, a flicker in the upstairs study, the room where the judge kept his private library, a room that faced the street with a large bay window, usually covered by heavy blinds. The blinds were slightly askew, disturbed, as if someone had brushed against them in a struggle or in haste, and through the slats she saw a beam of a flashlight cutting through the dark of the room, an erratic, searching beam that swept over the bookshelves, the desk, the walls.
It was not the steady light of a lamp. It was the frantic searching of an intruder, or perhaps a desperate host looking for something he had lost, and Evelyn watched, mesmerized, as the beam stopped, focusing on a specific section of the wall, a section where she knew, from years of observation and deduction, that the judge kept a wall safe behind a portrait of his late wife.
The flashlight beam held steady, and then a shadow crossed it, the silhouette of the young man, his profile sharp and angular, his hands moving against the wall, manipulating something, perhaps the frame of the painting. And Evelyn realized he wasn't just visiting, he was retrieving. He was taking back what had been stolen from his family. Not money, but truth, or perhaps evidence that the judge had kept as a trophy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that seemed to echo the tension across the street, and she leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass again,
wiping it away with a frantic swipe of her sleeve. The young man turned, looking away from the safe, looking toward the window, and for a terrifying second, the beam of the flashlight swung around, cutting through the glass, through the darkness of the street, and hitting the lens of her telescope with a blinding flash of white light that made Evelyn recoil with a gasp of pain, her hands flying to her face. She stumbled back, knocking into the side table, sending a porcelain figurine crashing to the floor, the sound shattering the silence of her house like a scream, and she froze, her heart stopping, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the consequences of her clumsiness. Had he seen the glint of her lens? Had he known he was being watched? The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and then, slowly, terrified, she crept back to the window, avoiding the telescope, peering through the raw gap in the curtains with her naked eye. The light in the study was gone. The window was dark. But the front door of house number 1 was opening again. The young man stepped out, but he was not alone. He was carrying something, a box, a metal box that looked like a bond tin, and he was moving fast, not with the hesitation of his arrival, but with the urgency of escape. He hurried down the driveway, his head down, clutching the box to his chest, and he reached the car, threw the box into the passenger seat, and scrambled behind the wheel.
The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the cul-de-sac, and the headlights flared on, blindingly bright, sweeping across the front of Evelyn's house as the car reversed violently, tires screeching on the asphalt.
And then, just before he shifted into drive, just before he sped away into the night, the young man looked up, directly at her window, directly at the gap in the curtains where she stood, and even across the distance, even in the chaos of the moment, Evelyn saw him nod, a single, sharp acknowledgement that chilled her blood to absolute zero. He knew. He had always known. Or perhaps the judge had told him. The car peeled away, racing down Willow Lane, disappearing around the curve, leaving only the smell of burnt rubber and the silence of the aftermath. Evelyn stood there, shaking, her mind reeling with the implications, but her eyes were drawn back to the house, to the open front door of number 1. It was still ajar, swaying slightly in the night breeze. The hallway inside was dark. No one came to close it.
The judge, a man who double-locked his doors even to check the mail, had left his fortress wide open to the night. Evelyn knew, with the certainty of a librarian who knows when a story has reached its inevitable tragedy, that the judge was not coming to the door. She knew that the balance had not just shifted, it had been destroyed. And she knew that she could not stay in her house, safe behind her curtains, not when the door to the mystery was standing wide open, inviting the darkness in. She gripped her cane, her knuckles white, and turned away from the window, looking toward her own front door. She had to go out. She had to cross the street. She had to know what was in the room where the flashlight had been. She moved through her hallway, the air feeling colder now, the shadows longer, and she reached for the handle of her front door, her hand trembling so badly she could barely turn the latch. She opened it, and the night air rushed in, smelling of ozone and fear, and she stepped out onto her porch, the first time she had left her house after dark in 10 years. The street was empty. The other houses were sleeping, or pretending to sleep. House number 1 loomed ahead, a dark monolith with a gaping mouth. Evelyn stepped off her porch, her cane clicking on the pavement, a rhythmic countdown to discovery, and she began the long, terrifying walk across the asphalt, her eyes fixed on the open door of the judge's house, where the darkness seemed to be waiting for her, pulsating, alive. She reached the edge of the judge's driveway, her breath coming in painful gasps, and she looked up at the study window. It was black. She looked at the door. It was still open, just a few inches, revealing a slice of the foyer floor. She walked up the path, the lions on the knocker seemingly mocking her approach, and she reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the cold wood of the door. She didn't want to push it.
She wanted to turn around and run back to her archives, to bury herself in paper and forget she had ever seen the car. But the red file in her basement demanded a conclusion. The story demanded an ending. She pushed the door. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing the cavernous hallway of Judge Thorne's home.
It was pitch black inside, save for a faint, flickering light coming from the study upstairs, a light that shouldn't be there, a light that looked like the reflection of a fire, or perhaps a candle left burning. And then, from the top of the stairs, from the heart of the darkness, she heard a sound. It was not a moan. It was not a cry. It was the sound of a page turning, a slow, deliberate, dry sound of paper sliding against paper.
Evelyn froze on the threshold, 1 foot in the safety of the night, 1 foot in the terror of the house. The sound came again. Swish. And then a voice, low, gravelly, and impossibly calm, drifted down from the landing, a voice that did not belong to the judge and did not belong to the young man. "You brought the wrong file, Evelyn," the voice whispered, echoing through the empty hall. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She hadn't brought the file. It was still on the table in her basement, which meant the voice wasn't talking about what she held in her hands. It was talking about what she held in her mind. She looked up into the dark, her eyes straining, and saw a shape detach itself from the shadows of the banister, a figure, watching her, waiting for her. The figure took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under a weight that sounded too heavy for a human, and the faint light from the study caught the edge of something metallic in its hand. "Come in," the voice said, and this time it sounded like the house itself was speaking. "We have a lot of reading to do." Evelyn couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only stare into the abyss of the hallway, realizing that her surveillance had been a two-way mirror all along, and that while she had been watching the street, something inside the street had been watching her. The figure raised its hand. The light flared, and Evelyn stepped forward into the dark. The darkness inside was not merely an absence of light, but a physical substance that seemed to coat her throat with a taste of stale tobacco and old dust. And as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the ambient hum of the streetlights and the distant murmur of the sleeping suburbs, Evelyn realized that the silence within House 1 was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the breath from her lungs and left her standing on the precipice of a decision that could not be unmade. She did not move immediately, for her eyes required precious seconds to adjust to the gloom, forcing her to rely on the auditory landscape of the house, listening for the creak of a floorboard or the rustle of clothing that would betray the location of the figure who had invited her in. But there was only the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep in the recesses of the ground floor, a slow, metronomic heartbeat that seemed to mark the remaining seconds of her autonomy. The foyer was vast, a testament to the judge's ego, lined with wainscoting that felt cool and damp to the touch as she reached out to steady herself, her cane hovering an inch above the Persian rug to avoid the sharp, percussive click that might shatter the fragile truce between her and the shadows. "The stairs, Evelyn." The voice drifted down again, softer this time, stripped of any threat and replaced with a terrifying, intimate patience, as if he were a doctor waiting for a recalcitrant patient to enter the examination room. And she realized with a jolt of nausea that he knew her name, knew her gait, and likely knew exactly how long it would take her to navigate the treacherous expanse of the hallway. She began to move, her orthopedic shoes sinking into the thick pile of the runner, each step a silent negotiation with gravity, Her gaze locked on the landing above, where the faint, orange glow of the study flickered like a dying ember, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the ceiling molding in a macabre pantomime of the secrets this house had kept for 20 years.
As she ascended, the air grew warmer, carrying with it a scent that made her skin crawl, a smell she recognized from the archives of her own memory, the unmistakable, acrid sweetness of accelerant, masked by the heavy perfume of leather bindings and furniture polish, a sensory contradiction that confirmed her deepest fears about the lineage of the man waiting for her.
She reached the landing, her breath coming in ragged, shallow pulls, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she paused to grip the newel post, her knuckles white, staring at the partially open door of the study, the very room she had watched for thousands of hours through her telescope, the room where she had seen money exchange hands, where she had seen the judge pacing in his guilt. And now, finally, she was on the other side of the glass, no longer the viewer, but the subject, trapped inside the diorama she had obsessively curated.
The door to the study was not just open, it was inviting, positioned at an angle that allowed a sliver of the interior to be seen, revealing a wall of books that stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines dull and indistinct in the low light. And as she pushed the door fully open with the tip of her cane, the hinges gave a low, mournful groan that seemed to signal the point of no return.
The room was dominated by the fireplace, where a small, controlled fire crackled in the grate, providing the only illumination and explaining the flickering light she had seen from the street. But it was not the fire that arrested her attention, nor was it the empty tumbler of scotch resting on the mahogany desk, but rather the figure seated in the judge's high-backed leather chair, turned away from her, facing the window that looked out onto the street.
"Closer," the figure said, and the voice was dry, like leaves scraping over pavement, lacking the sonorous boom of the judge, belonging instead to a throat that had inhaled too much smoke, or perhaps to a man who had spent a lifetime whispering in rooms where he wasn't supposed to be.
Evelyn stepped onto the hardwood floor of the study, the sound of her cane finally making contact, a sharp tack that punctuated the crackling of the fire, and she saw that the desk was covered not in legal briefs or court documents, but in photographs, dozens of them, spread out in a chaotic fan like a losing hand of poker. She moved to the edge of the desk, her eyes adjusting to the firelight, and the breath froze in her lungs as she looked down at the images, expecting to see crime scene photos of the arson, expecting to see the blackened ruins of the warehouse from 1998. But instead, she saw herself. There were photos of her checking her mail, photos of her pruning the dead roses in her front garden, grainy, high-contrast photos taken with a telephoto lens, showing her silhouette in the window of House 12, her eye pressed to her own telescope, capturing the irony of the watcher being watched, a loop of surveillance that had been tightening around her neck for months, without her ever feeling the noose.
"The red file covers the acquittal," the man said, and the chair began to swivel slowly, the leather groaning under his weight, turning to face her. "It documents the bribe Judge Thorne took to let my father walk free, and it documents the suppression of the witness testimony. But you made a fundamental error, Evelyn, an error common to historians and archivists who believe that the past is a static thing that can be trapped in a box."
He came into view, the firelight catching the side of his face, revealing the sharp, angular jawline of the young man she had seen visiting the house. But his eyes were old, tired, and devoid of the malice she had expected, filled instead with a weary sort of pity. "You assumed the story ended with the acquittal," he continued, gesturing to the empty chair opposite the desk, an invitation that felt more like a command. "You assumed that my father was the villain, and the judge was the corrupt official, and you, the noble observer, were the only one holding the scales of truth. But you never asked yourself why the judge let him go, or what the fire was actually meant to burn." Evelyn gripped her cane, using it as a barrier between them, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the narrative she had constructed over 2 decades with the reality sitting before her, realizing that the red file in her basement was not the weapon she thought it was, but merely a single chapter in a book she had never actually read. "I am not sitting," she said, her voice trembling but firm, clutching the shred of authority she had left. "Where is Marcus? Where is the judge?" The young man smiled, a sad, fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, withdrawing a small silver key that glinted in the firelight. "Marcus is indisposed," he said softly, placing the key on the desk and sliding it across the polished wood until it rested just inches from her hand. "He realized quite recently that the debt he owed my family could not be paid with money, and that the silence he purchased 20 years ago was renting space in a house that was about to collapse."
Evelyn looked at the key, recognizing it instantly, for it was an antique skeleton key, the kind that opened the heavy, erratic locks of the older homes on Willow Lane. But it was not a key to the judge's house, nor was it a key to her own. It was a small, brass key, labeled with a tag that bore a single, handwritten address: House 4.
"The arson wasn't about insurance money, Evelyn," the young man said, leaning forward, his face dipping into the shadow so that only his hands remained visible, clasping together on top of the photographs of her. "It was about destroying records, specifically the adoption records stored in the basement of the municipal building that burned, records that connected half the families on this street to a singular, unpleasant event in 1978. The room seemed to tilt, the floorboards rolling beneath her feet like the deck of a ship in a storm, as the implications of his words crashed into the carefully organized architecture of her suspicions, shattering the walls she had built around the arsonist's guilt. "You brought the red file because you thought it proved a crime," he whispered, the sound seeming to come from the walls themselves.
"But the crime isn't in the fire, Evelyn. The crime is in the blood. And if you truly want to conclude your story, if you truly want to be the archivist you claim to be, you need to stop looking at the smoke and start looking at who lit the match."
He stood up then, a slow, unfolding movement that made him seem impossibly tall in the low-ceilinged room, and he walked past her, moving toward the door she had just entered, leaving her alone with the fire, the photographs, and the key. "I'm leaving now," he said, pausing at the threshold, his back to her, his silhouette framed by the darkness of the hallway.
"The judge left something for you in the bottom drawer, something that pairs with the key, but I would advise you to sit down before you open it, because the truth, unlike the fire, does not burn itself out." Evelyn stood frozen, listening to his footsteps recede down the hallway, listening to the slow, heavy thud of his boots on the stairs, and finally, the distant click of the front door opening and closing, sealing her inside the house with the ghosts of her own misconceptions. She was alone.
The fire popped, a harsh sound in the silence, and Evelyn looked down at the desk, at the silver key, and then at the bottom drawer of the desk, which was slightly ajar, revealing the edge of a thick, leather-bound ledger that smelled of mildew and earth. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle of the drawer, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, knowing that opening it would destroy the safety of her observation, knowing that she was about to cross the line from witness to accomplice. But the pool of the mystery was a gravity she could not resist. She hooked her finger around the handle. She pulled. The drawer slid open with a smooth, silent glide, and there, resting on top of the ledger, was a single, pristine envelope made of heavy cream stock, her name written on the front in the judge's sprawling, chaotic handwriting, and beneath the envelope, nestled in the velvet lining of the drawer, a black telephone began to ring.